Jim Turner sat alone in the dim glow of his living room, the only sound the steady tick of the old clock on the wall. Outside, the autumn wind rattled the brittle windowpanes of his small-town home in Ohio. He stared blankly at the crumpled blueprint on the coffee table, a design for a sustainable energy device he had dreamed up more than 30 years ago but never finished. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the faded notebook beside it, flipping through pages of calculations and sketches, remnants of a younger, hopeful version of himself. The silence was thick, almost suffocating, as the weight of decades pressed down on him. At 68 years old, Jim felt invisible. He had lost count of how many times he told himself it was too late to make a difference, too late to repair the relationships that had frayed beyond recognition, too late to dream again. The ache in his chest was more than just physical, it was the hollow echo of regret that had settled in his soul. For years, he had tried to push forward, fueled by stubborn hope and memories of what could have been. But tonight, it felt different. Tonight, he was ready to quit. The thought had been creeping in for weeks, creeping like a shadow that swallowed every flicker of light. His heart wasn't strong anymore, his body protested the smallest tasks, and the isolation gnawed at him like a relentless tide. The phone on the side table buzzed quietly, a reminder of the world outside his self-imposed exile. He almost didn't pick it up, but curiosity got the better of him. The screen lit up with a notification, a live stream titled "Reinventing Yourself at Any Age," featuring Elon Musk. Jim had never been a fan of the media circus surrounding billionaires, but something about the title caught him, a tiny spark flickering in the darkness. With a weary swipe, he tapped to watch. Elon's voice filled the room, crisp and unwavering, cutting through the silence. Age is not a limit, it's a challenge. A challenge to reinvent, to rebel against what you think you can't do. Failure isn't the end, it's a step on the path to something greater. The word struck Jim like a sudden gust of wind, shaking loose the dust that had settled on his dreams. For a moment, the walls around him seemed less confining, the clocks ticking less like a countdown and more like a heartbeat. He leaned forward, eyes fixed on the screen as Elon spoke of his own failures, the long nights, the near bankruptcies, the ridicule, and yet, the relentless refusal to quit. What if everything you believed about getting old was wrong? Elon's voice challenged, almost daring him to believe it. Jim's fingers hovered over the phone's keyboard, tempted to reply, to shout out that he was still here, still fighting, even if no one seemed to notice. But instead, he paused, caught between the despair that had held him captive and the fragile hope Elon had ignited. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from, Elon urged. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Jim's heart pounded as he slowly typed, Ohio. I'm still here. My dreams never died, but sometimes so does the will. He hesitated, then hit send. The notification disappeared, replaced by the steady stream of Elon's voice sharing tales of grit, courage, and reinvention. As the minutes ticked by, Jim felt something shift inside him, a stirring, like the first stirrings of life after a long winter. The house seemed less lonely, the night less endless. Maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late. The clock chimed softly, reminding him of the hour, and Jim took a deep breath, the crisp autumn air filling his lungs as if breathing new life into his tired body. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine a future where the past didn't define him, where the road ahead was uncharted but filled with possibility. He whispered to the empty room, maybe this is the moment it all changes. Outside, the wind carried a faint promise, and somewhere deep inside, a stubborn fire began to burn. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Jim Turner never thought of himself as a man who gave up easily. Born and raised in a small Ohio town where everyone knew your name and your history, he had grown up dreaming big even when the world around him felt small. His father had been a factory worker, a steady hand who taught Jim the value of hard work and precision. As a boy, Jim had always been fascinated by how things worked. Dismantling old radios, clocks, and lawnmowers, piecing them back together with his mother's cautious approval. By the time he was in college, his curiosity blossomed into ambition. He studied engineering with a zeal that surprised even himself. The future was wide open, and Jim pictured a life filled with invention, purpose, and recognition. When he married Susan, a schoolteacher with a warm smile and a fierce intelligence, Jim felt unstoppable. They built a home together on the edge of town, where the maple trees painted the streets red and gold every fall. For a time, life felt full of promise. But somewhere along the way, the sharp edges of reality began to chip away at that promise. The factory jobs Jim once dreamed of replacing with innovation disappeared one by one. Automation and outsourcing closed the doors that once seemed permanently open. His dreams of inventing a sustainable energy device flickered in the background, eclipsed by bills, responsibilities, and a growing family. Susan was patient and loving, but even she couldn't shield him from the creeping sense of failure that settled in his chest like a cold stone. Their daughter, Emily, was born with a bright laugh and a stubborn streak that mirrored Jim's own. He adored her fiercely but found himself drifting away from the man he wanted to be as work and life weighed heavier. The workshop in their garage, once a sanctuary filled with tools and half-finished projects, grew dusty and silent. On weekends, instead of building, Jim found himself napping in his recliner or watching old reruns on television. The man who had once dreamed of changing the world now felt trapped in the same small town, the same routines, the same quiet despair. Over the years, the distance between Jim and Emily grew. Teen years brought rebellion and silence, then anger and avoidance. After college, Emily moved to the city, and their conversations thinned until they stopped altogether. The last time Jim saw her was a Christmas dinner 2 years ago, filled with awkward silences and unsaid regrets. Susan passed away 5 years earlier, leaving Jim to face the empty house and the echo of memories that felt both distant and painfully close. Now, at 68, Jim often walked through the rooms of his home as if he were a ghost, a man trapped in a shadow of the life he once knew. The scent of Susan's favorite lavender soap still lingered faintly in the bathroom, a cruel reminder of loss. The living room couch, worn and faded, held the imprint of years of family gatherings that no longer came. He kept a photo of Emily on the mantelpiece, a snapshot of her at 16, eyes bright with life, unaware of the fractures to come. Each day, Jim fought a quiet war against the creeping emptiness. His health had started to fail subtly, a shortness of breath here, a twinge of pain there. The doctor's advice was always the same: slow down, take it easy, don't push yourself. But slowing down felt like giving up. Inside, Jim still felt the fire of that younger man, the one who believed that a single idea could change everything. One memory stood out above the rest, a symbol of what had been lost and what might still be found. It was the night he stayed in the garage until dawn, soldering wires and testing circuits, the scent of burning solder mingling with cold coffee and determination. Susan had knocked softly on the door before slipping away without complaint, leaving him to chase his dream alone. The prototype he worked on was a device designed to harness solar energy more efficiently, a green alternative that could have helped his town and others like it. But somewhere between the hope and the reality, life got in the way. That unfinished invention became a monument to his regrets. On nights like this, when the house was too quiet and the future too uncertain, Jim felt the full weight of his solitude. He remembered the laughter that once filled these rooms, the plans made over breakfast tables, the shared dreams now dissolved into silence. Yet even in that silence, the ember of possibility refused to die completely. Sometimes, he would close his eyes and imagine picking up the tools again, finishing what he started, sending a message to Emily not just of apology, but of perseverance and hope. He thought of the friends he'd lost touch with, the letters he never sent, the phone calls unanswered. The years had stretched long, but the need for connection and purpose still pulsed quietly beneath the surface. As autumn settled over the town, Jim's world felt like it was shrinking, but somewhere deep inside, a quiet defiance simmered. The man he had been, the man he wanted to be, were locked in a silent battle. Could the past be reclaimed? Could the future be rewritten? The questions haunted him, restless and relentless. Tonight, as he sat staring at the blueprints and the dusty notebook, that memory, the night of solder and coffee, returned with vivid clarity. It reminded him of who he was beneath the years of weariness and loss, a man capable of dreaming, creating, and fighting against the odds. For the first time in a long time, Jim allowed himself a glimmer of something he hadn't felt in years: hope. Maybe it wasn't too late to try again. Maybe the future still held a place for him. The wind outside picked up, shaking the leaves against the windowpanes like a soft applause. Somewhere beyond the quiet house, the world continued to turn, full of endless possibility. Jim leaned back, the weight of his regrets settling gently like dust on old shelves. He was a man marked by loss but not defined by it. And though the path ahead was uncertain, he was beginning to believe that the next chapter could be different, brighter, bolder, and filled with purpose once more. Jim Turner woke that morning with a heaviness in his chest that had nothing to do with his aging heart. The dim light from his bedside lamp cast long shadows across the room, and the quiet hum of the old furnace was the only sound accompanying his thoughts. His body ached, but it was the weight of doubt and loneliness that truly dragged him down. Is it too late? The question repeated like a broken record inside his mind. He shuffled to the kitchen, the floorboards creaking under his worn slippers, and stared out the window at the overcast sky. The trees had shed most of their leaves, and the chill in the air was a reminder that winter was coming, a season he always associated with endings. At 68, Jim felt like he was standing at the edge of a precipice, looking down into a foggy abyss where dreams went to die. He thought about the unfinished prototype, the dusty workshop, the blueprints folded and neglected on his desk. The very idea of starting again seemed impossible. He remembered the last visit to his doctor, who looked at his test results with a furrowed brow and gently advised, "Jim, you need to slow down. Your heart can't take the stress anymore. Maybe it's time to consider a quieter life." Quieter life. The phrase echoed through his head like a sentence sentencing him to fade away. But Jim was not ready to disappear into silence. Yet, every time he tried to grasp that stubborn spark inside him, it felt slippery, distant, almost unreachable. He thought of Emily, his daughter, the gulf between them widening with each unanswered call and unread message. The last text she sent was cold, brief, a reminder of the fracture that time had deepened. "Dad, maybe focus on taking care of yourself instead of chasing old ghosts." The sting of those words settled deep. He wondered if she truly cared or if she had already written him off as a man lost to the past. Even his neighbors seemed to have stopped noticing him, their polite nods fading into polite avoidance. Society had its own way of telling people like Jim that they no longer mattered, that youth was the only currency worth spending. That day, as Jim sat alone in the kitchen with a cup of cold coffee, his phone buzzed. A news alert popped up about Elon Musk's latest interview where he spoke about breaking free from limitations, no matter your age or past failures. Jim had heard of Elon Musk before, the entrepreneur who revolutionized electric cars and rockets, a man who dared to dream bigger than most. But seeing that notification felt different, like a lifeline thrown across the void. He clicked on the video. Elon's voice was calm but fiery. "Too many people believe there's a deadline on success, that after a certain age, you're supposed to step aside and accept the status quo. That's wrong. Age is a number, not a prison. The biggest risk is not taking any risk at all." Jim's fingers tightened around the mug, his knuckles white. Is it really possible to change at this stage, he wondered aloud. Elon continued, sharing stories of his own failures, the early Tesla models that almost bankrupted the company, the rockets that exploded on the launch pad, the countless skeptics who told him to quit. "When people told me it was impossible, I felt two choices, give up or double down. I chose to double down." The word struck a chord deep inside Jim. Yet even with this glimmer of hope, his inner war raged on. He felt trapped between fear and desire, uncertainty and resolve. Could he muster the courage to try again? Could he bear the pain if he failed? Later that afternoon, Jim's daughter called. He hadn't heard from her in weeks. The phone rang twice before he answered, voice cracking slightly. "Emily," he said quietly. She was brisk, distant. "Dad, I saw your blog. I don't know if you should be pushing so hard. You need to take care of yourself." The conversation felt strained, like walking on thin ice. Jim wanted to tell her he was scared, that he needed her, but the words caught in his throat. "I'm not giving up," he said finally. "I just need to find my way." Emily sighed, a mixture of frustration and sadness. "Just promise me you won't overdo it." The call ended with no resolution, just more questions hanging in the air. That evening, Jim sat in his favorite chair, the glow of the laptop illuminating his face. He scrolled through messages from strangers who had read his blog, some encouraging, others skeptical. A man from Texas wrote, "I'm 72 and just started learning to code. If he can do it, so can we." Another commenter reminded him, "Age doesn't define us, our choices do." Yet, for every note of hope, there was a whisper of doubt. He felt the push and pull of every emotion: fear of failure, hunger for purpose, loneliness, and the fierce need to matter. The house seemed too quiet, the nights too long. Somewhere in the back of his mind, the voice of his doctor warned again, the cold facts about his heart and his limits. Jim closed the laptop and looked out the window into the darkened street. He was caught in a relentless tug-of-war between the man he was and the man he still wanted to be. Could he rewrite the story of his life before it was too late? Could he silence the voices telling him to stop and listen to the one that dared him to start? Elon Musk's words echoed in the stillness, "The biggest risk is not taking any risk at all." As Jim's eyes grew heavy, he made a silent promise to himself. Tomorrow, he would take one small step forward. Not for fame, not for fortune, but for the chance to find himself again. The inner war was far from over, but for the first time in months, the scales seemed to tip, just slightly, toward hope. Jim woke the next morning with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The night's decision, fragile but firm, pushed him out of bed and toward the garage where his old workshop waited like a forgotten friend. The air was thick with dust and the faint scent of motor oil, and as he flicked on the single overhead bulb, the light revealed the scattered tools, blueprints, and half-finished parts that had been gathering years of neglect. For a moment, he stood still, overwhelmed by the silence and the memories. Then, slowly, he crossed the threshold and set to work. Inspired by Elon Musk's words about doubling down in the face of failure, Jim decided that the first step was simple: start moving again. The prototype, the dream, the hope, it all began with action. He wiped the layers of dust from the workbench and pulled out his old notebooks, tracing his fingers over the faded sketches that had once ignited his imagination. He reviewed the solar energy device plans with fresh eyes, noticing flaws and gaps he hadn't seen before but also sparks of brilliance. Jim didn't need to rebuild everything at once. He only needed to take one piece, one small project, and breathe life into it. For hours, he worked methodically, testing circuits, measuring voltages, and soldering connections. The familiar rhythm of tinkering brought a comforting focus, and with each tiny success, his confidence grew. Outside, the day passed unnoticed, the world carrying on without him. In the kitchen, his phone buzzed with messages from readers of his blog, a flood of encouragement, advice, and shared stories from people who refused to surrender to age or circumstance. "You're not alone," one message said. "Keep pushing." That night, Jim felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, hope taking root in his chest. The simple act of doing, of creating, gave him a new rhythm, a reason to rise. The next morning, he put on his walking shoes for the first time in months and stepped outside. The cold autumn air bit at his cheeks, but the movement awakened muscles long dormant. He walked down the quiet streets of his neighborhood, nodding to a neighbor who smiled with surprise and warmth. Each step was a small victory, a rebellion against the inertia that had kept him captive. Over the following weeks, Jim made his daily walks a ritual. He documented his progress on the blog, sharing his struggles and small wins alike. Readers from across the country began to follow his journey, responding with encouragement and questions. Some were also seniors, struggling with their own doubts. Some were younger, inspired by his courage. One day, he received an unexpected email, an invitation to speak at a local community center about his project and his journey. The thought terrified him, but he accepted. When the day arrived, Jim stood before a room of curious faces, his hands trembling slightly but his voice steady. He spoke honestly about regret, fear, and the decision to start again. He shared Elon Musk's words about age as a challenge, not a limit. The applause that followed was tentative at first, then genuine. Afterward, a woman approached him, Linda, a retired engineer who offered to help refine his design and connect him with local resources. For the first time, Jim felt a sense of belonging, a community of people who saw value beyond youth and profit. Back at home, he received a message from Emily. She had been watching the videos of his talks and reading the blog posts. "Dad, I'm proud of you," she wrote. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a bridge being rebuilt. Jim responded with a promise to keep trying, to keep moving forward. The garage, once a tomb of forgotten dreams, became a workshop of possibility. Each day, he chipped away at the prototype, learning new skills, accepting help, and pushing through doubts. He started small experiments, tested new materials, and even designed a website to share his progress. Jim wasn't just rebuilding a machine, he was rebuilding himself. The months rolled by, and with each passing day, the man who had been hours from quitting transformed. His heart grew stronger, not just physically but emotionally. The community around him grew as well, connected by a shared refusal to accept limitations. One chilly evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jim stood in his garage holding a small component of his device, the result of months of work. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress, a symbol of perseverance and rebirth. He thought back to Elon Musk's challenge to double down and take risks. Jim smiled softly and whispered, "This is just the beginning." For the first time in decades, he felt the thrill of possibility, the power of a single choice to change everything. The road ahead was still long, uncertain, but no longer a place of fear. It was a path of hope, courage, and relentless determination. Jim Turner was no longer a man defeated by time, he was a man rewriting his story, one small step at a time. The day Jim Turner had feared and hoped for arrived quietly but with the power of a storm breaking through long-held walls. It was a crisp Saturday morning when the email came through his inbox, flagged with a subject line that made his heart skip, "Your story has gone viral." For years, Jim had thought of himself as invisible, a man fading into the background of a world that prized youth and speed. Now, suddenly, thousands of people across the country were reading his blog, watching his videos, sharing his message of resilience and hope. The flood of responses was overwhelming. Comments poured in from strangers inspired by his courage, some sharing their own struggles with aging and reinvention, others offering support, encouragement, and even invitations to speak at events far beyond his small Ohio town. Jim sat at his kitchen table, hands trembling as he scrolled through the messages. Tears blurred his vision, not from sadness but from a mixture of disbelief and raw, aching joy. For the first time in decades, he felt seen. The story wasn't just about the solar prototype or the long road of setbacks, it was about a man who refused to quit, who challenged the narrative of aging as a sentence to invisibility. Among the messages was one that cut deeper than the rest. It was from Emily. After years of silence and cold distance, her words were simple but profound. "Dad, I'm sorry I doubted you. I'm proud of who you're becoming." The barrier they'd built over time began to crumble in that moment. Jim's voice cracked as he called her. They talked for hours, sharing regrets, hopes, and promises for a new beginning. The connection he'd feared was lost forever was slowly healing. The next weeks brought a whirlwind of change. Invitations to speak at community centers, senior groups, even a local university filled his calendar. Each event was a test, a chance to show that age was no limit to transformation. Jim's story resonated deeply, not just because of the invention he was building but because of the courage it took to start over. One evening, after a talk at a nearby library, an old friend approached him, Frank, a retired mechanic who'd been skeptical of Jim's ambitions but now looked at him with newfound respect. "I never thought you had it in you," Frank admitted, clapping Jim on the shoulder. "Guess I was wrong." That simple acknowledgement felt like a balm to years of self-doubt. Back in the workshop, the solar device began to take shape. Jim's hands, once shaky and uncertain, moved with renewed confidence. He tested circuits, refined designs, and adapted to new technologies he'd once thought were beyond his reach. The garage buzzed with life again, tools clanking and wires sparking in a symphony of creation. One night, as Jim adjusted a delicate component, the prototype emitted a steady glow, a sign that it was working. The triumph was not just technical, it was deeply personal. The man who had been hours away from quitting had broken through the fog of despair. But breakthroughs rarely come without new challenges. Jim's heart, though stronger, reminded him of its fragility. There were days of pain, of fatigue, of moments when the weight of past failures threatened to pull him under. Yet the support from the community, from Emily, and from unexpected new friends kept him going. He learned to listen to his body without surrendering his spirit. As winter deepened, Jim received a call from a local news station. They wanted to feature his story, to shine a light on a senior who had defied the odds and reclaimed his life. The filming was awkward at first. Jim wasn't used to being the center of attention, but he found strength in honesty. He spoke about regret and hope, about fear and determination. When the segment aired, it sparked a wave of new followers and supporters. Letters arrived from as far as California and Florida, from people inspired to start their own journeys of change. One particularly moving letter came from a man named Robert, 75, who had just enrolled in a night school art class. "If Jim can build a new life at his age, maybe I can chase my dream of painting again," Robert wrote. Jim's story was no longer just his own. It had become a beacon for others lost in the shadows of aging. The emotional climax came one cold evening when Jim sat on the porch steps, the prototype glowing softly inside the garage. Emily joined him, carrying 2 mugs of steaming tea. They sat in silence for a moment, the chill in the air softened by shared presence. "Dad," she said quietly, "I see you. Not just the man who was, but the man who is becoming. I'm proud to be your daughter." Jim's throat tightened, and for a long time, no words came. Finally, he whispered, "I thought it was too late. I thought the world had forgotten me. But maybe this is just the beginning." The past's heavy chains had been broken, replaced by a fragile but fierce hope. Jim knew the journey was far from over, but the breakthrough had given him something precious: belief in himself, in the power to change, and in the enduring value of a life lived with courage. As the night deepened, the stars emerged one by one, silent witnesses to a man who had chosen to rise, to fight, and to embrace the uncertain promise of tomorrow. The days after the news segment aired were a blur for Jim Turner. The small town where he had lived quietly for decades suddenly seemed alive with possibility, as if the very air had shifted. Invitations poured in, from community groups, local schools, even a regional innovation summit asking him to share his story. Each request was a reminder that he was no longer invisible. But beyond the spotlight and the applause, Jim found himself reflecting deeply on what this new chapter truly meant. Sitting in his workshop one evening, the glow of the prototype casting soft shadows on the walls, Jim thought back to the moment he was hours away from quitting. The despair, the loneliness, the doubt, they were real and raw. But they were also the soil from which this new life had grown. He realized the story wasn't just about building a device or regaining physical health. It was about reclaiming purpose and dignity in a world that so often sidelines people like him. That night, he penned a blog post titled "The Legacy I Choose," sharing his journey in a way that felt honest and vulnerable. He wrote, "I was never too old. I was just waiting for permission to matter again." The words resonated with thousands, sparking conversations among readers who felt the same way, forgotten, dismissed, but yearning to matter. Jim began mentoring others who reached out, people who had shelved their dreams or felt trapped by age or circumstance. He started an informal support group at the community center, where seniors gathered to share stories, dreams, and fears. The room buzzed with energy and possibility. Jim listened and encouraged, reminding them that transformation didn't require grand gestures, just the courage to begin. Through this, Jim built not only a legacy of invention but a legacy of empowerment. He saw that his true gift was not the solar device alone but the hope he ignited in others. One afternoon, Emily came to visit, the tension between them easing into a warm familiarity. She walked through the workshop, touching the blueprints and tools with curiosity and respect. "Dad," she said, "you've become an inspiration, not just to me, but to so many. You've shown what it means to fight for yourself." Jim smiled, feeling a deep peace he hadn't known in years. "I've learned that age doesn't close doors, it only asks us to find new ones." Outside, the seasons turned, and Jim's project grew stronger. The solar device was nearing completion, but Jim's greatest achievement was the community he helped build, people of all ages coming together to challenge the notion that life has an expiration date. At a regional conference, Jim spoke about failure, resilience, and the power of one choice. He shared Elon Musk's philosophy that the biggest risk is not taking any risk at all, urging everyone to embrace their potential regardless of age. The crowd's standing ovation was more than recognition, it was a celebration of shared courage. In quiet moments, Jim thought of the future, not just his own but the future he hoped to help shape for others. He wanted to leave a legacy not defined by what he built but by how he inspired others to keep building their own lives. The sun set behind the hills as Jim stood on his porch, feeling the cool breeze and the steady beat of his heart. He whispered to himself, "I was never too old. I was always just waiting to start again." The story that began with despair had become a testament to the power of hope, resilience, and transformation. Jim Turner's journey was a reminder that no matter where life places you, the choice to rise, to change, and to matter again is always within reach. Jim Turner stood in his workshop early that morning, the first light filtering through the dusty windows and casting a golden hue over the scattered tools and sketches. The solar device prototype sat on the workbench, humming softly, a testament to months of effort, setbacks, and breakthroughs. But Jim's mind was already racing ahead, envisioning what came next. The journey had shifted him, but he knew this was no final destination. It was a new beginning, a gateway to uncharted territory. He recalled Elon Musk's relentless push toward the future, how failure was just data, and every setback was an opportunity to pivot, adapt, and evolve. Inspired by that mindset, Jim resolved to take his invention beyond his garage, to bring it to a wider audience and make a tangible difference. The local university's innovation fair was just weeks away, and Jim had secured a spot to showcase his work. Preparing for the event felt daunting. Doubts crept in, would anyone care? Could he compete with younger, more tech-savvy inventors? But beneath the fear was a steady pulse of determination. Jim started making calls, reaching out to contacts, even accepting help from Linda, the retired engineer who had become a trusted collaborator. Together, they refined the prototype, improved its efficiency, and designed a presentation that told not just the story of the device but the story of perseverance and hope behind it. As the fair approached, Jim felt a mix of excitement and nerves. The night before, he couldn't sleep, his mind buzzing with anticipation and the old familiar fear of failure. But then he remembered Elon Musk's words, "When others say it's impossible, that's exactly when you have to double down." On the day of the fair, the community center buzzed with energy, students, entrepreneurs, curious neighbors, and skeptics all gathered under one roof. Jim set up his display carefully, laying out the device alongside photos and excerpts from his blog. People stopped by, intrigued by the older man with the quiet determination and the story that seemed to ripple through his every word. Questions came fast and curious, some skeptical, some hopeful. Jim answered with honesty, sharing both the technical details and the personal journey that had brought him here. As the day went on, more people gathered, drawn not just by the invention but by the narrative of courage and renewal. One young woman, an environmental science student, approached Jim with tears in her eyes. "Your story, it's changed how I think about my own fears. Thank you." The impact was tangible, a ripple effect of hope spreading through the room. At the end of the day, Jim was invited to speak at the closing ceremony. Standing on the stage, bathed in the soft glow of spotlights, he felt a profound shift. This was more than recognition, it was an affirmation of his journey and a call to continue. He spoke about embracing change at any age, about the power of small steps, and about never surrendering to the idea that it's too late. The applause was thunderous, and Jim's heart swelled with gratitude and purpose. That night, as he returned home, Jim realized the horizon he had once feared was no longer a boundary but an invitation. He was no longer a man trapped by age or doubt, he was an explorer of new possibilities. The workshop felt alive with potential, and Jim was ready to keep pushing forward, fueled by a vision that was bigger than himself. In the days that followed, Jim expanded his blog, sharing insights from the fair and stories from the people he met. He connected with other inventors and advocates, joining networks that valued innovation at every stage of life. Each new connection was a thread weaving a tapestry of community and purpose. Through it all, Emily remained by his side, her support growing stronger with each step. Their relationship healed and blossomed into a partnership built on mutual respect and hope. One afternoon, as they walked through the park, she said, "Dad, you're proof that the future belongs to those who dare to keep trying." Jim smiled, feeling a warmth that filled the spaces loneliness once occupied. The legacy he was building was no longer just about inventions but about transformation, his own and that of everyone willing to believe that age is just a number, not a cage. Standing at the edge of this new horizon, Jim knew that the journey would continue to challenge him, to stretch him, but he welcomed it. Because this time, he wasn't alone. The man who had been hours away from quitting had become a symbol of resilience, a beacon lighting the way for others to follow. And with every sunrise, Jim Turner stepped forward, ready to write the next chapter of his remarkable story. Jim Turner knew that every journey worth taking would have its share of critics, but he hadn't expected the sting to cut so deep. The buzz from the innovation fair and viral news stories had brought new attention, but also new scrutiny. Some articles dismissed his solar device as outdated or amateurish. Comments on social media ranged from doubtful to downright cruel, questioning his age, his ability, even his relevance. "Why bother?" one post read. "Old men like him should retire and leave innovation to the young." The words hit like cold steel. Jim sat in his workshop late one night, staring at the glowing prototype, feeling the weight of those judgments pressing on him. Doubts crept back into his mind. Was he foolish to keep trying? Was he clinging to a past that no longer mattered? Yet somewhere beneath the ache, a stubborn spark refused to be extinguished. He recalled the voice of Elon Musk, a man who had faced failure, ridicule, and near bankruptcy yet refused to quit. "If something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor." Jim repeated the mantra silently, letting it steady his breath and steel his resolve. The next morning, he decided not to retreat but to engage. He wrote a heartfelt post on his blog titled, "Why I Keep Going," addressing the criticism openly. He shared his fears, his failures, and the small victories that made it all worthwhile. He invited his readers into the messy, imperfect reality of transformation. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Messages flooded in from people who had felt invisible or underestimated, people inspired by Jim's courage to face their own challenges. Among them was a letter from a woman named Grace, a 70-year-old retired teacher who had started learning to code. "Your story gave me permission to try," she wrote. Thank you for reminding us that age is not a cage. Jim felt a renewed sense of purpose. The critics, he realized, were part of the landscape, but they did not define his journey. What mattered was the community of hope and determination he was helping to build. He also took practical steps to strengthen his project and credibility. Linda connected him with a local tech incubator that welcomed innovators of all ages. There, Jim met mentors who helped him refine his device and presentation. He learned to embrace feedback as a tool for growth rather than a threat. One afternoon, a young engineer named Marcus visited Jim's workshop. Marcus was full of energy and ideas, eager to collaborate and learn from Jim's experience. Together, they tackled technical challenges, bridging generations through shared passion. Marcus often said, "You bring wisdom I don't have, I bring fresh eyes." That's the power of teamwork. Jim smiled, grateful for the partnership and the reminder that transformation was never a solo act. However, not all critics could be swayed. At a community meeting, a council member questioned the value of funding projects led by seniors. The remark stung publicly, and Jim found himself grappling with the harsh reality of ageism ingrained in society. Yet rather than retreat, he stood firm. He spoke from the heart about the strength found in experience and the danger of writing off entire generations. His words resonated with many in the room, sparking a conversation about inclusion and respect. Slowly, the tide began to turn. Media outlets invited Jim back for interviews, this time highlighting not just his invention but the broader message of resilience. His story became a symbol of defying stereotypes and rewriting what it means to age. Throughout the challenges, Emily became an anchor. When doubts clouded Jim's mind, she reminded him of the impact he had made, the lives he had touched, and the legacy he was building. "You're more than a project," she told him. "You're a living example of courage." As winter gave way to spring, Jim felt the transformation not just in his work but within himself. The fire that nearly went out had been fanned into a steady flame. He understood now that criticism, while painful, was part of the journey toward change. It was a test of conviction, a call to resilience. Jim's story was no longer just about a man rebuilding a solar device, it was about a man who refused to be silenced or sidelined by age or doubt. He had become a voice for a generation too often ignored, a beacon for those still searching for their spark. And with every step, Jim Turner moved forward, not despite the critics but because of the strength they unwittingly inspired in him. Jim Turner sat quietly in his living room, the soft hum of evening settling around him as he glanced at the framed photographs lining the mantel, snapshots of a life filled with love, loss, and time slipping away faster than he had ever imagined. Emily's letter still lay open on the table, its words echoing in his mind, "Dad, I'm proud of who you're becoming." Those simple sentences carried a weight he hadn't expected, stirring memories of days long past and hopes for days still to come. For years, Jim had held his distance from his daughter, the walls between them built from years of misunderstanding, silence, and regret. But now, with the tides of change sweeping through his life, he felt a yearning to bridge that gap, to heal the fractures and rebuild what time had weathered. Reaching out wasn't easy. The first phone call was tentative, awkward, filled with long pauses and gentle words. Emily's voice was cautious but kind, revealing the same mix of hope and fear he felt inside. Over time, those calls grew longer, more frequent, until one spring afternoon, Emily came home. She stepped into the workshop filled with tools, blueprints, and the glowing prototype that had become a symbol of Jim's transformation. "It's incredible what you've done here," she said softly, eyes shining with a mixture of awe and warmth. The moment was fragile but profound, a new beginning wrapped in old love. As days passed, they shared meals, stories, and laughter, rekindling a connection that felt both new and deeply familiar. Jim learned about Emily's struggles and triumphs, her dreams and disappointments, and in turn, he shared the chapters of his journey, the fears he'd faced, the failures he'd endured, and the hope that now guided him. Rebuilding trust wasn't without challenges. Old wounds sometimes surfaced, and moments of doubt crept in. But with each honest conversation, the walls softened, replaced by understanding and forgiveness. Jim realized that healing was not about erasing the past but embracing it, learning from it, and choosing to move forward together. The rekindling extended beyond Emily. Jim reached out to other estranged friends and family members, some surprised, others hesitant, but all touched by his genuine desire to reconnect. He understood that relationships, like his invention, required patience, care, and persistence. One afternoon, Jim hosted a small gathering in his home, a circle of friends, new and old, sharing stories and celebrating the resilience that had brought them together. The room was filled with warmth, laughter, and the quiet power of human connection. Through these rekindled bonds, Jim found strength and belonging. He recognized that no man is an island, and the journey of transformation is richer when shared. Emily became more than a daughter, she became a partner in the mission Jim had embraced, a mission to inspire others to believe in their capacity for change. Together, they planned community workshops, inviting seniors to explore creativity, technology, and self-expression. The workshops became a beacon, drawing participants eager to rediscover purpose and passion. Jim often reflected on how Elon Musk's fearless pursuit of the future had inspired him not just to build but to connect, to break down barriers and forge new paths. The lesson was clear: transformation is both personal and collective. As summer approached, Jim and Emily attended a local festival where Jim was invited to speak about his journey. Standing on the stage, looking out at the faces of people from all walks of life, Jim felt a profound sense of belonging and purpose. He spoke not only of innovation and resilience but of love, forgiveness, and the power of relationships to heal and transform. The applause that followed was not just for the invention but for the man who had chosen to open his heart and rebuild what had once been broken. In the quiet moments afterward, Jim realized that rekindling relationships was one of the greatest triumphs of his journey. It was proof that no matter the scars or the years lost, connection could be restored and love could endure. The path ahead was still uncertain, filled with challenges and opportunities alike. But with Emily by his side and a renewed circle of friends and family, Jim Turner faced the future with a heart open wide, ready to write the next chapter, not alone, but together. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Jim Turner never imagined that his small-town invention and personal story would catch the attention of a major tech company, let alone lead to an unexpected opportunity that could change everything. It started with an email, brief, professional, and somewhat surprising. A representative from a renewable energy startup had stumbled upon Jim's blog and news interviews. They wanted to discuss a potential partnership. At first, Jim was skeptical. How could a retired engineer from a quiet town be relevant in a fast-paced tech world dominated by younger innovators and Silicon Valley giants? But curiosity and a cautious optimism nudged him to respond. The meeting was set for the following week, held virtually due to geographical distance. As Jim logged in, his heart pounded with a mixture of excitement and nerves. The screen flickered on, revealing a team of sharp, enthusiastic professionals eager to learn about his solar device and the story behind it. They spoke about sustainability goals, innovative approaches to clean energy, and the potential impact of Jim's design if scaled with modern technology. Jim shared his journey candidly, the frustrations, the breakthroughs, and the renewed sense of purpose that had driven him forward. As the conversation unfolded, it became clear that the partnership wasn't just about the device. It was about embracing experience, resilience, and the untapped potential of those society often overlooked. The team admired Jim's refusal to quit, echoing Elon Musk's own philosophy of persistence and radical thinking. Over the next few weeks, Jim collaborated closely with the startup's engineers and strategists. They refined the prototype, integrated advanced materials, and developed plans for pilot programs in local communities. The process challenged Jim to learn new skills, adapt his ideas, and step outside his comfort zone. Each hurdle was met with determination, fueled by the belief that his work could make a meaningful difference. Meanwhile, the partnership brought Jim renewed visibility and credibility. Media outlets picked up the story of the unlikely collaboration between a senior inventor and a cutting-edge company. Interviews, podcasts, and articles spread the message of hope and innovation beyond the small-town borders. Jim's blog readership surged, and messages of encouragement flooded in from around the country. The unexpected opportunity also reshaped Jim's personal life. Emily, witnessing her father's growth and the doors opening before him, felt pride and admiration deepen. Their conversations expanded beyond repair to planning a future where Jim's passion and experience could inspire even more people. Jim's workshop transformed into a hub of activity, buzzing with visitors eager to learn and contribute. Linda and Marcus continued to support the project, their intergenerational teamwork a living testament to the power of collaboration. As pilot programs launched, communities began to see the benefits: reliable, affordable solar power reaching homes that had long struggled with energy access. Jim visited these sites, meeting people whose lives were changing thanks to his invention and the collective effort behind it. These moments reaffirmed his purpose and fueled his drive to keep pushing forward. Yet, amid the excitement, Jim remained grounded. He remembered the hours before quitting, the loneliness and despair that had once threatened to consume him. Those memories served as a compass, guiding him to stay humble, focused, and committed to the greater good. The experience also deepened Jim's understanding of transformation, not just personal but systemic. He recognized the importance of challenging societal assumptions about age, capability, and innovation. The partnership was proof that when opportunity meets courage, barriers can be broken and new paths forged. One evening, reflecting on the journey, Jim sat with Emily on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the clear night sky. "I never thought I'd be here," Jim said quietly. "But maybe the greatest invention isn't the device itself, it's the chance to prove that it's never too late." Emily smiled, squeezing his hand. "You've always had that spark. Now, the world is finally seeing it." As the future unfolded with promise and possibility, Jim Turner embraced the unexpected opportunity not just as a breakthrough in technology but as a breakthrough in life. The man who had once been hours away from quitting had stepped into a new role, a trailblazer, a mentor, and a living example that transformation knows no age limit. And with every sunrise, Jim continued forward, ready to meet whatever challenges and opportunities lay ahead. Just as Jim Turner began to feel the momentum building behind his invention and his mission, life reminded him that transformation was never a straight line. The setback came quietly at first, an unexpected glitch in the solar device's new design that caused a critical failure during a pilot test. What had seemed like a minor flaw quickly escalated into a serious problem, threatening months of progress and shaking Jim's confidence to its core. The news hit hard. The startup announced a pause on the project to investigate the issue, and media coverage turned from praise to skepticism. Headlines questioned whether the invention was truly viable, hinting at Jim's age as a potential factor in the failure. Social media buzzed with criticism, some voices more harsh than before. Jim sat in his workshop, the hum of machines replaced by a heavy silence. The prototype lay dismantled on the table, wires and components scattered like fragments of his dreams. Doubts flooded in: was he out of his depth? Had he misled everyone with false hope? The weight of disappointment pressed down, threatening to extinguish the fire he had fought so hard to kindle. Yet amid the darkness, a familiar voice echoed in his mind. Elon Musk's relentless drive to learn from failure, to push harder when the odds seemed stacked against him. Failure is an option here. If things are not failing, you are not innovating enough. Those words, once abstract, now became a lifeline. Jim realized that setback was not the end but a vital part of the process. With a deep breath, he picked up his tools and began to dissect the problem, determined to understand and fix what went wrong. Linda and Marcus rallied around him, offering support, expertise, and encouragement. Together, they worked long hours, testing components, redesigning parts, and troubleshooting every possibility. The community, too, sent messages of hope, reminding Jim that true innovation often comes after the hardest trials. Emily stood by his side, offering strength and perspective when frustration threatened to overwhelm. "This is what you signed up for," she said gently. "The path isn't easy, but it's worth it." Slowly, progress emerged. The team identified the root cause, a faulty connection in the energy converter that had been overlooked in the rush to scale up. The fix required redesigning key elements, but the solution also opened new doors for improved efficiency and durability. Jim felt a surge of hope as the prototype came back to life, stronger and more refined than before. The setback became a catalyst for deeper learning and collaboration. Jim documented every challenge and breakthrough, sharing the raw truth with his growing audience. His vulnerability resonated, turning critics into supporters and skeptics into believers. The narrative shifted from failure to resilience, from defeat to determination. Media outlets revisited the story, highlighting the comeback and the lessons learned. Jim's story inspired others facing their own struggles to keep moving forward. Through the setback, Jim grew not only as an inventor but as a leader and mentor. He began hosting virtual workshops, sharing insights on perseverance and innovation with seniors across the country. His message was clear: setbacks are not signs of the end but invitations to grow stronger. As spring turned to summer, Jim reflected on the journey. The man who had once been hours away from quitting now stood firm, fueled by the knowledge that every challenge was a step towards something greater. The setback had tested him deeply, but it had also revealed his true strength, a resilience born from hope, experience, and an unyielding belief in the power of change. With renewed vigor, Jim Turner stepped forward, ready to embrace the next chapter of his remarkable transformation. After the setback that threatened to derail everything, Jim Turner found himself at a crossroads where many might have chosen to turn back. Yet, for Jim, this moment became the true turning point. The place where despair was met with determination, and failure morphed into opportunity. It began on a crisp autumn morning when Jim received an unexpected call from a representative of a national innovation grant program focused on supporting inventors over 60. The grant could provide funding to refine and expand his solar device project, but more importantly, it was a vote of confidence, a public acknowledgement that his work mattered. As Jim sat in his workshop, surrounded by tools, sketches, and memories, he realized that this was more than just financial support, it was validation of a journey defined by resilience and hope. The application process was rigorous. Jim pored over documents, wrote essays, and gathered letters of recommendation from Linda, Marcus, and even Emily. Each word was an affirmation of his mission and the community that had grown around it. The waiting period was filled with anxiety and anticipation, but Jim leaned into the uncertainty with the mindset he had cultivated, a mindset inspired by Elon Musk's fearless pursuit of bold goals despite the risks. When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor. Finally, the news arrived: Jim Turner had been awarded the grant. The moment was surreal, a culmination of years marked by struggle, hope, and relentless effort. With the new resources, Jim expanded his team, incorporating diverse talents that brought fresh perspectives and energy. The project moved into a new phase, focusing not only on technical improvements but also on community education and sustainable implementation. Jim embraced leadership roles he never imagined, mentoring younger engineers while drawing from his own lifetime of experience. The grant also opened doors to partnerships with educational institutions and nonprofits. Jim spearheaded workshops teaching seniors how to engage with technology, build prototypes, and pursue their own innovations. The ripple effect was powerful. People who once felt left behind now found themselves part of a vibrant movement of changemakers. Public speaking engagements multiplied, and Jim's story became a beacon of possibility across the country. His talks were filled with honest reflections on aging, failure, and transformation, reminding audiences that every stage of life holds potential for growth and reinvention. Alongside the professional achievements, Jim's personal life flourished. His renewed bond with Emily deepened, their shared work and vision weaving a new fabric of family. Friends old and new gathered around, united by a common belief in second chances and the power of perseverance. Through it all, Jim remained grounded in the lessons learned during his darkest hours. The importance of community, the necessity of vulnerability, and the unshakable strength found in hope. One evening, as Jim prepared for a keynote speech at a national conference on innovation and aging, he reflected on how far he had come. The man who had been hours away from quitting now stood on a stage commanding attention and respect. His voice carried the weight of lived experience and the fire of unrelenting purpose. The speech was met with standing ovations, media acclaim, and invitations to expand his impact further. Yet, for Jim, the greatest victory was internal, the transformation from a man defined by past regrets to a man embracing a future brimming with possibility. As the conference closed, Jim thought back to the call from Elon Musk's team months earlier, the spark that had ignited this entire journey. He realized that while Musk's vision had been the catalyst, the true power lay in his own willingness to step into discomfort, face fear, and refuse to let age define his limits. Jim's journey was no longer just about an invention or a personal comeback. It was a living testament to the truth that transformation is always possible, that hope can flourish even in the hardest soil. With the turning point firmly behind him, Jim Turner moved forward into the unknown, not with certainty, but with courage, purpose, and the unshakable belief that the best was yet to come. Jim Turner woke up one morning with a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, a clear sense of purpose that went beyond the solar device, beyond the grants and media attention. It was a quiet but powerful shift, the kind that settles deep in your bones and reshapes your view of what it means to live fully. Over the years, Jim's journey had been marked by struggle and triumph, doubt and determination, and through it all, he'd rediscovered a spark he thought long lost. Now, he realized his mission was bigger than any single invention. It was about helping others find their own paths to transformation. Inspired by this insight, Jim decided to create a community initiative called the Second Act Project, dedicated to empowering people over 60 to explore creativity, innovation, and meaningful engagement regardless of their background or circumstances. The project offered workshops, mentorship, and online resources designed to build skills and confidence in technology, art, and entrepreneurship. Jim envisioned a space where people could share stories, learn from each other, and support one another in redefining what it meant to age with purpose and passion. With Emily's help, Jim launched the initiative in their town's community center. The first workshop attracted a diverse group, retirees, former professionals, caregivers, and dreamers all seeking connection and direction. Jim led with humility and honesty, sharing his story not as an expert but as a fellow traveler on the road of reinvention. The room buzzed with energy as participants discussed their interests, fears, and aspirations. Some wanted to learn digital skills, others to start small businesses or explore artistic endeavors long shelved. Jim encouraged them to see their age not as a limitation but as a source of wisdom and resilience. The impact was immediate and profound. Participants began to take small steps, learning to code, writing memoirs, creating crafts, and starting community gardens. Jim celebrated each success, knowing that transformation was often a series of small victories rather than giant leaps. The Second Act Project grew steadily, gaining support from local organizations and volunteers. Media outlets featured stories about the initiative, highlighting the power of community and the importance of embracing lifelong learning. Jim's message resonated far beyond the town's borders, inspiring others to start similar programs in their own communities. As the initiative expanded, Jim also found personal fulfillment in mentoring individuals one-on-one. He connected deeply with people like Grace, the retired teacher learning to code, and Marcus, the young engineer whose friendship had become a bridge between generations. These relationships enriched Jim's life, reminding him that purpose was not just about achievement but about connection and legacy. Throughout this chapter of his life, Jim continued to embrace challenges with the mindset that had carried him through so much, the willingness to take risks, learn from failure, and keep moving forward. He reflected often on Elon Musk's words about the importance of daring to dream and refusing to be constrained by fear or convention. The biggest risk is not taking any risk, Jim would say to his workshop groups, urging them to step outside their comfort zones. At home, the bond between Jim and Emily deepened further. Together, they planned expansions of the project, incorporating virtual classes to reach those unable to attend in person. Emily's enthusiasm and tech savviness complemented Jim's experience and wisdom, creating a dynamic partnership that energized their work. Jim also made time for quiet moments. Walking through the neighborhood, tending a small garden, watching sunsets from his porch. These rituals grounded him, reminding him that purpose was not just about doing but about being fully present in each moment. Through it all, Jim Turner embodied a powerful truth, that it is never too late to find new purpose, to ignite new passions, and to live a life of meaning. His journey had taken him from the brink of giving up to a place of vibrant engagement and hope. And as he looked to the future, Jim knew that the best chapters were still unwritten. Jim Turner stood at the edge of his workshop window, watching the morning light spill over the quiet town, casting long shadows on familiar streets and rooftops. The air carried a fresh scent of possibility, the subtle promise of a day brimming with potential. He felt a surge of gratitude mixed with a quiet excitement, emotions that had become companions on his unexpected journey. Embracing the future was no longer a vague concept but a deliberate choice he made each day. Years ago, he would have shied away from change, burdened by doubts and fears about his age and abilities. But now, those limitations felt like distant echoes, overshadowed by the vibrant energy that came from living with purpose. Jim's work with the Second Act project had transformed not just his own life but the lives of many around him. It had become a movement, a beacon for those seeking to break free from the constraints of conventional aging and rewrite their stories. The community center buzzed with activity, seniors learning digital art, former professionals launching startups, and lifelong learners embracing new skills. Jim often found himself marveling at the resilience and creativity blossoming around him, reminded that growth knows no age. One afternoon, a letter arrived from a prestigious university inviting Jim to join a panel discussion on aging and innovation. It was an opportunity he hadn't anticipated but embraced wholeheartedly. Preparing for the event, Jim reflected on the path that had brought him here, from the lonely hours in his workshop to the moments of breakthrough, the setbacks, and the rekindled relationships. He saw his story as part of a larger narrative about the evolving role of older adults in society, the power of intergenerational collaboration, and the importance of challenging outdated assumptions. At the university, Jim shared his insights with students, faculty, and fellow innovators. His message was clear: age is not a barrier but an asset. Experience, wisdom, and a willingness to embrace change can fuel innovation and community building. The audience responded with enthusiasm, many inspired to rethink their own perceptions of aging. After the event, Jim connected with young entrepreneurs eager to learn from his journey. He felt a renewed sense of purpose in mentoring, passing on lessons about resilience, adaptability, and the courage to take risks. These exchanges were energizing, bridging generational divides and sparking new ideas. Back home, Jim continued to nurture his own projects, experimenting with advancements in renewable energy and sustainable living. His workshop was a laboratory of ideas, filled with prototypes, sketches, and the hum of creative energy. Each day brought new challenges and discoveries, reinforcing his belief that the future is shaped by those willing to embrace uncertainty and persist. Jim also made space for reflection and self-care, understanding that embracing the future required balance. He maintained daily walks through the town's park, savoring the changing seasons and the quiet beauty of nature. These moments grounded him, reminding him that growth is both an external and internal journey. The bond with Emily deepened as they planned expansions for the Second Act project, incorporating virtual platforms and partnerships with organizations nationwide. Their collaboration was a testament to the power of family, shared vision, and mutual support. Together, they dreamed of a world where age is celebrated as a time of opportunity, creativity, and contribution. Jim often thought back to the spark that had ignited his transformation, the unexpected call from Elon Musk's team that challenged his assumptions and propelled him into action. That moment was a reminder that sometimes, embracing the future means saying yes to the unknown, stepping into discomfort, and trusting in the journey. As the sun set on another day, Jim stood on his porch, looking out over the town he loved. The future was uncertain, yes, but it was also bright with promise. He felt ready, not just to face what was next but to shape it, to live fully, and to inspire others to do the same. In that quiet moment, Jim Turner embodied a profound truth: the future belongs to those who embrace it with courage, curiosity, and an open heart. And for him, the best was still to come. Jim Turner never underestimated the power of relationships, yet during the hardest years of his journey, some of his most important connections had frayed or fallen silent. The loneliness that had crept in after his divorce, the distance from his children, and the loss of old friends had left him feeling isolated, a feeling that no invention or accolade could fully erase. But as Jim's life gained new momentum, he realized that true transformation wasn't just about personal achievements or public recognition, it was about healing the bonds that give life meaning. Reaching out to those he loved, those he had pushed away or neglected, became a priority. The first person Jim thought about was his daughter, Karen. Their relationship had been strained for years, a casualty of misunderstandings, missed opportunities, and the unspoken pain of a broken family. Jim had often thought about calling her, but fear and pride held him back. What if she rejected him? What if it was too late? One evening, after a long day at the community center, Jim sat down with his journal and wrote a letter, not just an apology but an honest sharing of his journey, his regrets, and his hopes for reconciliation. With Emily's encouragement, he sent the letter, not expecting a response but hopeful nonetheless. Days passed. Then one afternoon, his phone rang. It was Karen. Her voice was tentative but warm, filled with cautious hope. They talked for hours, peeling back layers of hurt and misunderstanding, rediscovering the threads of love that still connected them. Their conversations became regular, each call a step toward healing and rebuilding trust. Jim felt a profound relief and joy he hadn't known in years. Encouraged by this breakthrough, Jim reached out to other family members and old friends. He attended reunions and community events, allowing himself to be vulnerable and open to connection. Some relationships rekindled with ease, others required patience and grace. He learned that healing was not linear but a process of persistence, forgiveness, and acceptance. One particularly meaningful reunion was with his longtime friend, George, who had drifted away after Jim's divorce. Over coffee in a sunlit cafe, they shared stories, laughter, and tears, reaffirming a friendship that had weathered life's storms. These restored relationships enriched Jim's life in unexpected ways, providing support, encouragement, and a deeper sense of belonging. They also became an integral part of his work with the Second Act project. Jim invited loved ones to participate, bridging personal and community renewal. Through these connections, Jim discovered that transformation was not just individual but collective, that healing oneself often meant healing the relationships that shape us. The journey of rekindling relationships also challenged Jim to confront old patterns and beliefs. He realized that fear of rejection had held him back longer than any external obstacle. By embracing vulnerability, he opened the door to authentic connection and growth. Jim shared these lessons openly in his workshops and talks, encouraging others to reach out, forgive, and rebuild their own relationships. As Jim nurtured these bonds, he also experienced a deepening of self-compassion. He forgave himself for past mistakes and accepted that imperfection was part of the human experience. This acceptance brought peace and strengthened his ability to love and be loved. The chapter of rekindled relationships was not without its challenges, but it was rich with meaning and renewal. Jim Turner learned that no matter the years lost or the wounds inflicted, it is never too late to heal, reconnect, and create new memories with those who matter most. In the tapestry of his life, these restored relationships became threads of strength and beauty, weaving together a future grounded in love and connection. And as Jim looked ahead, he knew that these bonds would continue to sustain and inspire him on the path of transformation. The microphone felt surprisingly light in Jim Turner's hand as he stepped up to the podium, facing a packed auditorium filled with college students, professionals, retirees, and families. The backdrop behind him read, "Voices of Innovation, Stories that Move Us Forward," but for Jim, this moment wasn't about innovation in the technical sense, it was about speaking from the heart. He had been invited to close the National Conference on Aging, Purpose, and Progress, a multi-day event that had attracted thought leaders, scientists, policymakers, and artists from around the country. When the organizers first reached out, Jim hesitated. What did he have to say to an audience like that? He wasn't a celebrity or an academic or a world-renowned innovator. But Emily had looked him in the eyes and said, "Dad, they didn't invite the version of you who once doubted himself, they invited the man who proved everyone wrong, including himself." Now, standing under the stage lights, Jim looked out over the sea of faces, took a steadying breath, and began. He didn't start with technical specs or timelines. He started with the moment it all changed, the day he nearly gave up, the night he stood in his workshop ready to shelve the dream for good. He talked about regret, about the ache of feeling invisible, the slow crawl of doubt that comes when the world tells you your best years are behind you. The room was silent. He shared how a single unexpected call, sparked by a quote from Elon Musk, ignited a spark in him. Not because Elon handed him a solution, but because Musk's voice dared him to challenge everything he believed about himself. "I realized that I had spent more energy convincing myself I was too late," Jim said, "than I ever spent actually trying." He told them about rebuilding his solar prototype, about the blog he almost didn't start, about reconnecting with his daughter and repairing old wounds. He talked about the failures that taught him more than his successes. And he spoke openly about fear, the fear of looking foolish, the fear of wasting time, the fear of being irrelevant. "But let me tell you something," he said, his voice strong now, rising. "There's nothing irrelevant about experience. There's nothing wasted about trying. And there's absolutely no expiration date on impact." As the words flowed, Jim could feel the room lean in. People nodded. Some wiped their eyes. The energy shifted, not because he was promising something flashy, but because he was telling the truth. He ended with a challenge. "If you're sitting there thinking you've missed your shot, I want you to hear me clearly, you haven't. You are not too old, too broken, too behind. You are just getting started. Don't let the noise of doubt drown out the quiet voice inside you that still dares to dream. Listen to that voice. Answer it. And then do something, anything, to move forward." When he stepped back, the applause didn't come in a burst. It swelled slowly, like a wave gathering strength. People stood. They cheered. Some approached the stage after, thanking him, hugging him, telling him their own stories of almost quitting. That day, Jim Turner's voice carried, not just through the auditorium, but across the internet, as clips of his speech were shared, reposted, and translated. "The Man Who Refused to Fade" trended for days. The clip reached millions. And somewhere in California, a certain tech CEO retweeted the video with just 3 words, "This is resilience." But fame wasn't the point. Jim didn't want to be a celebrity, he wanted to be a catalyst. What mattered to him most was what came after, the letters from older veterans who decided to write their memoirs, the woman in her 70s who started an online business selling handmade quilts, the grandfather who fixed up his old motorcycle and rode across 3 states to see his grandson for the first time. Jim had become a voice people trusted, not because he had all the answers, but because he had walked the hard road and come out the other side with scars and hope. He made time to respond to emails personally, to sit with those who showed up at his doorstep, to listen as much as he spoke. He told his truth and created space for others to do the same. The Second Act project exploded in participation. Chapters popped up in cities and towns nationwide, many led by people Jim had never met in person. What connected them wasn't his name, it was the story they all shared, the story of what happens when someone decides to try, no matter how late it seems. Jim remained humble through it all. He kept walking every morning. He kept tinkering in his workshop. He stayed close to Emily, who had become not just a partner in this mission but one of its fiercest protectors. Late one evening, after a particularly busy week, Jim sat on the back porch, watching the stars appear one by one in the inky sky. The world had gotten a little louder around him, but this, the quiet, the stillness, this was still his favorite part. Emily joined him, mugs of tea in hand, and they sat together in the silence for a while before she said, "You know what I think, Dad? I think your voice didn't just wake something up in you. I think it gave a whole lot of people permission to wake something up in themselves." Jim didn't answer right away. He just smiled, looked up, and whispered a quiet thank you to the stars, to the people who had believed in him, and maybe even to that unexpected call that started it all. His voice had carried. And it wasn't done yet. The first time Jim Turner heard his granddaughter speak in front of a group of people, he felt something shift inside him, a quiet, emotional quake that began in his chest and spread outward until his fingers trembled slightly where they rested on his lap. She was only 12, standing confidently in the front of a local library, reading a short essay she'd written titled, "My Grandpa is an Inventor." The audience, a mix of parents, kids, and a few community leaders, smiled and nodded as she read about how her grandfather had almost given up but instead became a hero to her and to many others. Jim wasn't a man who cried easily, but sitting there, hearing his story told through the lens of a young heart, he felt tears slip down his face, not from sadness, but from the staggering weight of what had unfolded over the last year. What had started with silence and despair had turned into something bigger than anything he had dared to imagine, a legacy. Not a legacy of awards or money or even inventions, but of courage, reconnection, and the ripple effect of one decision not to quit. That moment at the library became a turning point, not for Jim's growth, which had already taken root, but for his understanding of impact. It was one thing to change your own life. It was another thing entirely to see how that change unlocked something in others. The Second Act project continued to flourish. They had recently launched a mentorship program that paired older adults with students and young entrepreneurs across the country. Jim found himself in weekly Zoom calls with people from all walks of life, a 73-year-old jazz musician mentoring a high schooler in Kansas, a retired NASA engineer teaching kids in Detroit how to code, a former seamstress in Florida running a quilting program for young mothers trying to rebuild their lives. The stories poured in, stories of laughter, healing, second chances, and brave first steps. Jim's workshop had become a kind of pilgrimage site for those inspired by his journey. People would drive in from out of state just to talk, share coffee, and ask him, "How did you really do it? How do you start over?" He always gave the same answer: "You don't start over all at once. You start again by doing one small thing differently. You don't have to believe the whole mountain can be climbed, you just have to be willing to take the first step today." One visitor, a man in his late 60s named Paul, stayed late one evening. Paul had lost his wife 3 years ago and said he'd been living in neutral ever since. After spending the day with Jim, touring the workshop, helping solder wires, and eating grilled cheese sandwiches in the kitchen, they sat outside on the porch, watching the sunset bleed across the sky. "I think I'm ready," Paul said, staring out at the horizon. "Ready to try something. Not big. Just, something." Jim nodded and said, "That's all it takes." The next week, Paul emailed a photo of himself leading a woodworking class at his church. These were the moments that fed Jim's soul more than any headline or feature interview. These were the seeds of legacy, not static things like buildings or plaques, but living, breathing change passed from hand to hand, from heart to heart. In the midst of this, Jim also felt the passing of time more sharply. His body didn't recover as quickly as it used to. He moved a little slower, woke up a little stiffer. But now, those signs of age didn't scare him. They felt earned. They were reminders that life's value wasn't measured in youth or speed, but in depth and meaning. One evening, after speaking at a statewide aging conference, Jim was approached by a woman who had remained in her seat long after the rest of the crowd dispersed. She introduced herself as the widow of a man Jim had once worked with, decades ago, a man Jim barely remembered. But she told him how her husband had admired Jim's persistence even back then, how he had talked about him over dinner, and how seeing Jim's resurgence in the news gave her the courage to leave her house for the first time in 6 months. "You gave me permission to feel alive again," she said, gripping his hand with both of hers. Jim didn't know what to say. What could you say to that, except to hold her hand tighter and whisper, "Thank you for telling me." As his reach expanded, Jim became intentional about documenting the story behind the story, not just the big events, but the quiet in-between moments, the fears, the hesitations, the tiny acts of bravery. He began writing a memoir, not for fame, but for legacy, for Emily, for Karen, for his granddaughter, for every person who might one day feel invisible or finished or broken, and who needed to hear, from someone who had been there, that they still had more to give. Elon Musk, still occasionally checking in through mutual connections, even invited Jim to speak at a closed-door summit on unconventional innovation. Jim was honored, but when he took the mic, he didn't speak about solar cells or electrical engineering. He spoke about mindset. About identity. About what it means to feel discarded and how dangerous that feeling is, not just for individuals, but for a society that loses out on wisdom when it writes off its elders. Elon nodded from the front row. Afterward, he walked over and said, "You know, Jim, a lot of people build things. But very few people rebuild themselves. You're one of the few." Jim never forgot those words. They echoed in his heart on quiet days, the ones when progress was slow or the workshop was empty. They reminded him that his legacy was already living in every person who dared to believe their life wasn't over. That legacy wasn't something you left behind. It was something you built every day, one choice, one conversation, one act of courage at a time. And so, as summer began to fade into fall again, Jim stood on the porch beside Emily, now a full partner in everything he did, and watched the sun settle into the horizon. The town was quiet, but his heart was not. It beat with gratitude, with vision, and with a legacy not of inventions, but of invitations, for others to rise, to reach, and to believe again. The invitation came on a Tuesday morning, tucked in between an envelope from the power company and a handwritten thank you card from a high school student Jim had mentored. At first glance, it looked like junk mail, a sleek, minimal envelope, no return address. But when Jim opened it, his hands froze. It was from Tesla. Not a form letter. Not a mass mailer. A personal, embossed invitation from Elon Musk's team to attend the unveiling of a new experimental energy hub in Texas. And not just attend, speak. "Jim, we believe your story embodies the spirit of this project. We'd be honored to have you share a few words," the letter read. He read it 3 times. Then a 4th. It had been nearly 2 years since that strange, unexpected phone call had saved him from giving up in his garage, and now, Elon Musk, the man whose mindset had once been a distant echo through a podcast, was asking him to stand on a stage again, not just as a symbol of resilience, but as a peer. Jim wasn't intimidated this time. Nervous, sure. But not afraid. He'd already spoken on dozens of stages, shared his story with thousands, helped hundreds of others reclaim their sense of purpose. What was different about this event, though, was that it brought everything full circle. The Energy Hub was built around ideas similar to Jim's early solar storage concept. His first invention, the one he almost threw in the trash. And now, that same concept had grown in parallel with others like it into something real, something global. He packed light for the trip. Just one small suitcase, a notebook, a few copies of his memoir, and a worn piece of graph paper folded 3 times over, his original sketch. The flight to Texas was quiet and smooth. As the plane coasted above the clouds, Jim looked out the window and let his mind drift. He thought about being 67, standing alone in a dusty garage, his fingers shaking, his heart heavy with the weight of irrelevance. He thought about the years of silence, the broken relationships, the way time had crept up like fog around a familiar shore. But mostly, he thought about what changed, one spark, one choice, one belief that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't done yet. The event itself was breathtaking. Tesla's new facility looked like something from the future: glass, steel, sunlight pouring in through solar-lit windows. Outside, the dry Texas air buzzed with anticipation as engineers, innovators, press, and special guests filled the space. Jim was greeted like family. Dozens of team members knew his name, recognized his face, even quoted lines from his speeches. Elon himself greeted him in person, shaking his hand firmly and saying, "Jim Turner, the man who reminded the world that wisdom doesn't expire." Jim smiled, struck again by how surreal it all felt, and yet, how right. He took the stage just before the unveiling. The lights weren't too bright. The crowd wasn't too loud. Just a quiet expectancy, a space carved out for truth. He didn't bring notes. He didn't need them. A few years ago, Jim began, I stood in a garage, surrounded by dust, silence, and the sound of my own doubt. I had an idea that no one wanted, a body that didn't move like it used to, and a heart that felt like it had nothing left to offer. But one voice, one challenge from someone who dared to believe differently, pushed me to try again. I didn't change the world in a day. I just changed one thing about how I showed up. And from that one thing, everything else began. He shared how failure taught him more than success, how pain brought him closer to people, and how age had become his greatest asset. He looked out into the crowd of young engineers, old mentors, and curious observers and said, "You don't have to be young to start. You just have to be brave enough to begin." The room erupted in applause, not performative, but deep and resonant. Elon smiled, nodded, and joined Jim back on stage to unveil the hub. It was a powerful moment, not just because of the technology, but because of what it represented, the meeting of generations, of vision and wisdom, of fire and foundation. After the event, as the crowd dispersed and twilight blanketed the Texas sky, Elon and Jim stood outside near the edge of the facility. "You know," Elon said, looking out over the horizon, "the biggest breakthroughs don't always come from the most expected places. Sometimes they come from garages, and sometimes they come from people who refuse to listen to the world when it tells them they're done." Jim laughed, a soft, satisfied laugh, and replied, "And sometimes, all it takes is someone to remind them they're not." That night, back in his hotel room, Jim pulled out his old sketch. The paper was worn, the ink faded, but the lines still held meaning. He wasn't looking at a prototype anymore. He was looking at proof. Proof that every step, every setback, every second guess had led him here. Full circle. But even then, he knew this wasn't the end. It was just another loop in the spiral of growth. The circle never closes completely, it just expands. The next morning, Jim returned home to find a letter waiting on his kitchen table. It was from Paul, the man who had started the woodworking class. "Jim," it read, "you gave me the courage to take the first step. I want you to know, I'm now teaching full-time at the local rec center. People are showing up every week, and I finally feel useful again. Thank you for helping me remember who I was before the silence." Jim folded the letter carefully, added it to the growing binder of correspondence he kept not for glory, but for grounding. These letters, like seeds, had become his legacy. They were stories he didn't write, but had helped spark into being. That weekend, he visited the community center for a casual check-in. He didn't wear a badge. Didn't announce himself. Just walked the halls, smiling at new faces, shaking hands, answering questions. In one room, a woman was teaching calligraphy to a group of seniors. In another, a tech class was underway, led by a retired nurse. He saw creativity, noise, laughter, life. Emily met him at the entrance as he was leaving. "You okay, Dad?" she asked, sensing something quiet in his face. "More than okay," he said. "I just realized something." "What's that?" He looked back at the building, then at her, and said, "I used to think I missed my chance. But now I see, I just hadn't arrived at the right chapter yet. She nodded, her eyes soft. Feels like a good chapter. The best one yet, he said, and meant it. That night, Jim sat down at his workbench, not to build, not to fix, but to reflect. He opened a new page in his notebook, wrote the words, "Next chapter," at the top, and underneath that, scribbled an idea for a new program. A mobile second act bus that would bring workshops and tools to rural communities. As he sketched, he smiled. There was still more to do. Always more. But for now, he allowed himself to feel the fullness of the circle, how one moment of almost quitting had become the foundation for a movement. The journey wasn't about success. It wasn't even about reinvention. It was about permission, the kind you give yourself when you finally realize that the world didn't leave you behind. You just hadn't stood up yet. And when you do, it notices. Jim Turner had always believed the journey was about rediscovery, of purpose, of self, of what it meant to still matter in a world that too often moved on without looking back. But now, as the movement he helped ignite spread like wildfire across the country, Jim began to realize it had never really been about him. The Second Act project had reached a kind of critical mass. What started with a single solar panel prototype and a blog post shared by a handful of people was now a living, breathing network of change. Retired teachers were opening community schools. Former truckers were mentoring at-risk youth. Grandmothers were launching podcasts, musicians were forming intergenerational bands, and Vietnam vets were learning to code. Jim watched all of this unfold with a quiet awe. He received letters and emails daily, some handwritten, others sent from smartphones by trembling fingers belonging to people in their 70s and 80s learning how to text for the first time. The messages had one thing in common: they all told stories of people who thought it was too late, until they saw Jim, until they heard about the man who didn't quit, until they realized that the only thing standing between them and possibility was permission. He had become that permission. One afternoon, Jim visited a new second act chapter in Louisville, Kentucky. He was greeted at the train station by a woman named Rosa, 82 years old, who had once been a factory line worker and now ran a digital design lab for retirees who wanted to learn Photoshop and 3D modeling. Rosa didn't ask for a photo or a signature. She simply hugged him and whispered, "You gave me my hands back." Later, in that bright little lab filled with screens and buzzing printers, Jim watched a 76-year-old man animate a cartoon version of himself skateboarding across a virtual desert. Everyone cheered when the figure landed a backflip. And Jim? He laughed so hard tears streamed down his face. This was it. Not awards, not stages, this. The joy of people discovering they weren't done yet. Back home, he updated the interactive map on the Second Act website. Each new dot lit up with a soft pulse: Charleston, Boise, Detroit, Albuquerque. He clicked through the profiles of community leaders, all in their 60s, 70s, and beyond. Many had no formal training. Most had been out of work for years. But they were leading. They were showing up. And the younger generations were listening. The spark in others, this was the legacy that meant something. This was what endured. One night, Jim received a message from a woman in her early 30s named Denise. Her mother, a nurse who had retired early due to burnout, had recently joined a second act writing group. Denise wrote, "I used to think my mom was just tired. But now I realize she was grieving the loss of purpose. Your work brought her back to life. I didn't know I missed her until I saw her smiling again." Jim sat with that message for a long time. It hit differently. Maybe because it spoke to something deeper than productivity or purpose. It spoke to love. To visibility. To being known. He remembered those years when he had gone to bed each night wondering if anyone would miss him if he were gone. And now, here were strangers rediscovering one another because of a story he once thought no one would care about. He made a habit of sharing these stories, not to brag, but to inspire. At every gathering, conference, or online live stream, he told the stories of others before mentioning his own. "My story lit the match," he'd say. "But this fire belongs to all of you." Eventually, Jim was approached by a documentary filmmaker who had followed his journey for months. She wanted to create a series, not just about Jim, but about the ripple effect. Each episode would follow a different second act leader in a different city, showing how one man's comeback had sparked thousands. Jim hesitated at first. He didn't want the spotlight. But the filmmaker promised it would be about them, all of them. So he agreed, and filming began. The first episode featured Rosa and her digital lab. Another episode followed a 68-year-old former custodian who now taught physics at a night school. Another centered on a man who had been incarcerated for 25 years and, after release, started teaching life skills to youth with the help of his mentor, Jim. When the documentary aired on a major streaming platform, the response was overwhelming. Viewers from around the world reached out. Some wanted to volunteer. Others wanted to donate. Most just wanted to say thank you. But for Jim, the best part was the phone calls from the people in the episodes, who now walked taller, spoke louder, and led with pride. They had gone from forgotten to featured. From background to headline. From spark to flame. The success of the series brought new attention. Universities reached out. Tech companies. Policy makers. Even international organizations began studying the second act model. Jim didn't care much for the bureaucracy of it all, but he welcomed the platform. If the message could reach more people, he'd do whatever it took. Still, through it all, he stayed grounded. His mornings still started with a walk. His nights ended on the porch, usually with Emily by his side. They didn't talk much during those quiet moments. They didn't have to. The silence between them was full, of gratitude, of history, of the unspoken knowledge that something bigger than either of them had taken root. One evening, after a long day of virtual interviews and planning meetings, Emily looked over at him and said, "Did you ever think this many people would care?" Jim took a sip of his tea, considered the question, and said, "No. But I think they always needed something to believe in. I just happened to be the guy who stood up at the right time." He didn't mean it with false humility. He meant it honestly. The world hadn't changed because of one man. It had changed because one man dared to go first. And when he did, others followed. They saw themselves in him. In his fears. In his failures. In his fight to matter again. And in seeing him rise, they realized they could too. In the final scene of the documentary's last episode, there was a montage, Jim in his workshop, helping a kid solder wires, Rosa laughing as she animated a talking cat, the custodian-turned-teacher wiping tears as he watched his student graduate. And finally, a slow, wide shot of the map on the second act wall, pulsing with lights from every state, every community touched by the movement. Over that final shot, Jim's voice played softly, "We all get told the story that we peak young. That the finish line is somewhere around 50. But what if that story is wrong? What if your greatest work, your most important chapter, your loudest impact comes after everyone else stops looking your way? What if the second act is the one that really matters?" The screen faded to black. The spark in others, he saw it now in every letter, every visit, every trembling voice that had once doubted but now led. Jim Turner wasn't the story anymore. He was the beginning of it. And the story would go on. The morning air was crisp, and the sun was just beginning to rise over the hills that framed Jim Turner's small town. He laced up his walking shoes like he always did, but today something felt different. Not heavier. Not lighter. Just, complete. The dew glistened on the grass as he stepped onto the familiar trail behind his house. This was his ritual, the rhythm of thought and reflection that had anchored him long before anyone knew his name, before podcasts and interviews, before second act chapters sprang up in cities he'd never even visited. This walk, this quiet, this stillness, it reminded him of who he was without the noise. He passed the old oak tree where he and Emily used to sit when she was a little girl, and he paused, resting his hand on the bark, feeling the years in the lines of the wood. So much had happened. So much had changed. And yet, here it was, all still rooted in the same ground. As he walked, he thought about the last event he'd spoken at just a week before. A high school auditorium filled with teenagers who had chosen to spend their Saturday listening to people old enough to be their grandparents. Jim had sat in the back row at first, watching as a retired firefighter talked about learning French, and a former waitress spoke about launching her home bakery at 72. The kids didn't fidget. They didn't scroll their phones. They leaned in. After the talks, a young man, maybe 17, approached Jim and said, "Sir, I used to think old people just waited to die. But today I realize they're living the chapters we haven't gotten to yet. I hope I grow up to be like that." Jim had smiled, shaken his hand, and said, "I think you already have the most important part, you're listening." That one comment had stayed with him all week. It meant something. The next generation wasn't just watching, they were learning. They weren't tuning out, they were tuning in. And maybe that was the greatest legacy of all, to bridge the gap, to remind the world that wisdom and wonder could exist in the same space. He made it to the halfway point of the trail and sat on the bench overlooking the quiet fields. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, one he had carried with him every day since the Tesla event in Texas. On it were 10 words, scribbled quickly in Elon Musk's handwriting: never settle. Never wait. Never believe the best is behind you. Elon had handed it to him after the unveiling, along with a smile and a quiet word: "You proved more than I ever could." Jim hadn't known what to say then. He still didn't. But those 10 words had become a quiet mantra on the days when his knees ached or the headlines got noisy or the silence of the house reminded him how much time had passed. He read them again now, let them sink into the morning, and then he tucked the paper away and stood. The rest of the day unfolded like most others: a few phone calls with second-act leaders, lunch with Emily, time in the garage to tinker with a new battery casing he'd been playing around with. But that night, he pulled something new from his drawer, a letter he'd started months ago and hadn't finished. A letter to himself. Not the Jim of today, but the Jim of 2 years ago, the one standing in that cold garage, ready to give up. He smoothed out the page and began to write. "Dear me. You're tired. You're convinced no one's listening. You think your best days are somewhere far behind you. But I need you to know something, desperately, urgently, completely: you are wrong. Not because everything's about to get easy. Not because someone's going to swoop in and save you. But because you are not done. Not even close. There is more in you than you can see from where you're standing right now. There is life, purpose, impact, connection, invention, love. There are people who need you, even if they don't know it yet. There are second chances waiting. Not to fix everything, but to remind you that you still matter. That your voice still has weight. That your story is not over. So put down the fear. Pick up the tools. Step out of the dark. One step is enough. Sincerely. You. Alive. Awake. And just getting started." He signed it with a shaky breath, folded it slowly, and placed it in the drawer beneath the old graph paper drawing of his first prototype. Some things were meant to be kept close. Others were meant to be shared. This was both. Over the next few weeks, Jim made fewer public appearances, not because he was retreating, but because the work had moved beyond him. The leaders he had mentored were now mentoring others. The ripple had become a wave. He spent his time writing more, building a curriculum with Emily for high school seniors on intergenerational wisdom, and visiting second-act centers around the state. He also found time for the small things he'd once forgotten: the Sunday breakfasts, the quiet dinners, the crossword puzzles he always cheated at but pretended not to. And through it all, he kept walking. Every morning, every path, every tree he passed became part of a tapestry of gratitude. One morning, as fall leaves danced around his shoes and the wind carried the scent of apples and pine, he stopped in the middle of the trail and looked up. The sky was wide and open, the kind of sky that made you feel both small and infinite. He smiled. Not because of anything in particular, but because of everything. He had once believed his story was over. But now, standing here, heart strong, purpose clear, surrounded by echoes of a movement that bore his fingerprints, he knew the truth. It had never been too late. Not when he almost quit. Not when the world seemed quiet. Not when his knees ached and his inbox overflowed. Never. Too late. The journey hadn't ended in a breakthrough or a standing ovation or a statue. It had ended, if it had ended at all, in a million tiny awakenings. 1,000 reconnected families. 100 reinventions. One man had stood back up. And because he did, others followed. That was the real story. That was the message. And so, in the final entry of his memoir, Jim wrote simply. If you're reading this and wondering if it's too late, stop. It isn't. Get up. Call someone. Build something. Write the first sentence. Walk the first block. Open the toolbox. Open the laptop. Open your mouth and tell someone your story. You are the only person who can do what you were meant to do. And the world? It's not waiting for you to be perfect. It's just waiting for you to begin. He closed the notebook, stood up from his desk, and turned off the light. The night was quiet. The stars were out. And somewhere, someone just like him, tired, uncertain, maybe alone, was taking their first step into something new. And that was enough. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?